We're going to move even a little further east tonight. And this will be the last in the series of what I would call pre-medieval or early medieval. After this, it will start getting more what I think most of you would be interested in. But I want to talk tonight about three figures. Two of whom are saints, one of whom was not. And it's going to sound in some ways a lot like Wenceslas, but at the end I want to ask you to make some comparisons about that. I'm going to talk about three people who were from what were known as the Rus. The Rus were, well, actually, they were Vikings, is what they were, but they didn't live up north. They had come down these river. That's the Dnieper and that's the Don, I think. They'd come down these river routes mostly from Sweden, and pretty much taken over this a lot of this area here. Now, this had been Slavic. But they came down, these Viking types, and they were known as the Varangians, but that's what they were. They were Vikings. And they, during the period I'm going to be talking about, in this area here, modern Ukraine mostly, and your surrounding areas, they were the elite. They were the warrior elite. They were the nobility, sort of. But most of the people in the area are Slavs. So think of it as being sort of like England after the Norman conquest. You had a difference here, and yet they were gradually becoming one people. They were polytheists. They built in wood, not stone, and their culture, as regards art, music, architecture, was all pretty basic. And they were surrounded by hostile people, as everybody seems to be in those days. They were basically a tribal people, not really a nation. They were a group of tribes who finally put together, we'll talk about that, under one leadership, but there was constant tension, constant rebellions. It was a mess, as most of the world was, and frankly, as most of the world still is. Some of them were Christian, but most of them were pagans. And they were really polytheists because, on the one hand, you had the deities, gods and goddesses, that the Varangians had brought down with them, who were the same as the rest of the Vikings. And then on the other hand, you had those of the Slavs. So it was kind of it was pretty much a muddle. There was no written code of law. Things were run on a purely autocratic basis. Whoever was the strongest made the rules and changed them at will. And it was all very basic. So I want to talk first about Saint Olga. Olga was born in 890, died in 925. We don't know where she was born. We don't know exactly when she was born, because there's not so much in the way of records from that period. But she was definitely born in Pleskov, which was a Varangian settlement, and she seems to have been reasonably high-born because she got married to Prince Igor I of Kyiv. And she was probably not more than 15 years old when they were married. They had a son named Sviatoslav. That was their first child. After Sviatoslav's father died, Igor I died. Igor was under, After his father died, Igor, Olga's husband, who was still underage, was put under the guardianship of a local noble and relative called Oleg the Wise. And he was the one who really kind of brought things under control to some degree. He established a degree of authority over a number of the surrounding peoples and conquered some neighboring tribes. And he's the one who said, okay, we need a capital city, and it's going to be Kiev. So this loose tribal federation, which now included even some people of Turkish origin, even some Turks, rather, became known as Kievan Rus. And it's a territory that covered parts of what's now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So, all right. There was a neighboring tribe called the Dravilans, and as was, it seems to be the case with all these people, they and the Kievan Rus were sometimes allied and sometimes enemies. I mean, it was always constantly shifting. The Dravillians had joined the Kievan Rus in military campaigns against the Byzantine Empire, but they were not allies. They were tributaries. They were required to pay an annual tribute to, or pay tribute whenever Igor asked for it. So they stopped paying tribute when Oleg died. And instead they gave the money, the tribute money, to somebody else. In other words, they were trying to secede. So Igor, Olga's husband, set out for the Dravillian capital, which is only a couple of days' ride away. These were small areas. And to bring them back into the fold. Well, they saw the size of Igor's army, and the Dravillians said, well, yeah, maybe we better go back to Igor, and they paid tribute to him. So Igor turned around to go back home. No fighting. They just backed down. But he decided that he hadn't asked them for enough tribute, and he was going to go back and get more. He did not take many men with him. He only took a personal escort rather than more important. That was a mistake. The Dravillians murdered him. According to one Byzantine source, Igor was killed in a manner that we can trace all the way back to Greek myth, where two trees are tied down, two young trees that are springy are tied down, and the guy's tied to them, and then they're cut and tore him in half. Well, after Igor's death, that was in 945, Olga, who's still pretty young now, became the regent for her son, Sviatoslav, who was only 3 years old. She was the first woman we know to be a ruler among the Kievan Rus. We don't know a whole lot about her rule of Kiev, but what we do know comes mostly, not completely, but mostly from a book, which you're going to hear mentioned a good bit, which is known as the Primary Chronicle. It's a history of Kievan Rus from about 850 to 1110. And it's believed to have been compiled in Kiev about 1110 by somebody. We have no idea who he was, or she. But it does give an account of her regency, beginning with her response to the murder of her husband. Now, it's almost certainly not historical, but I'm including because its continuing popularity does give some insight into the nature of pagan Kievan Rus. Now, this is the story. What we do know for sure is that she did go to war, or declare war, whether she went herself or not, I don't know, on the Dravillians for killing her husband, and did beat the heck out of them and reduce them to virtual servitude. But according to the story, and it's just too good not to tell, the Dravillians, having killed King Igor, decided that, well, now we're the big dogs. They're going to pay tribute to us. And even more than that, their prince, Prince Mal, at last a name I can be sure I know how to pronounce, Prince Mal sent messengers to Olga proposing that she marry him and therefore bring Kiev under Drevilian lordship. He, according to the story, and I keep repeating, it is a story, as you will soon see, sent 20 Drevilian negotiators by boat to Kiev to pass along the king's message and to ensure Olga's compliance. They arrived in her court and told the queen why they were in Kiev, or as the chronicle puts it, to report that they had slain her husband and that Olga should come and marry their Prince Mal. Olga's response, according to the chronicle, is, this is a speech attributed to her, "Your proposal is pleasing to me. Indeed, my husband cannot rise again from the dead, but I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat and remain there with an aspect of arrogance. I shall send for you on the morning, and you shall say, 'We will neither ride on horses nor go on foot. You must carry us in our boat, and you shall be carried in your boat.'" Well, when the Drevlians returned the next day, they waited at the boat. And the people of Kiev, who probably had been previously briefed, did indeed carry them in their boat all the way to Olga's. The ambassadors saw this as having been intended by Olga as both a great honor and a sign of the Kievan subjection. They brought them into the court, where they were dropped into a trench that had been dug the day before and buried alive. That's what this, oops, not, oh, you got it, well, thank you. The other picture that was up there is a picture from the 19th century, a 19th century drawing, engraving of this story. It's this, and that's not the whole story. We're just getting started here. It's still very popular in Russia and Ukraine. Can you see it? Great. All right, good. That, by the way, is called Olga's Revenge, and it's by Fyodor Bruni, who was a 19th century artist. Wow. She then sent a message, now that she's buried these guys alive, to the Drevilians, saying that they really should send their most distinguished men to her in Kiev so that she might be accompanied to their prince with the honor due him. So the Drevlians, who are not too bright, unaware of what had happened to the first group, gathered another party of men to send the best men who governed the land of Dereva, according to the Chronicle. When they arrived, she said, "Oh, you've had a tough journey. I'm sure you'd like to have a bath before we have a formal meeting." And they had a bathhouse, and she invited the men to be bathed there and change and come see her. When they entered the bathhouse, they locked it from the outside and set it on fire. So that's another bunch of Drevlians going. She sent another message to the Drevlians. This time she said, "Well, I'm on my way, but you must prepare great quantities of mead in the city where you killed my husband, that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast for him." Now, this funeral feast is a pagan custom. It's not, look, don't think of this as being a sort of polite reception after the funeral. No, this is a drunken, knockdown, drag-out orgy, and it was, it was widely practiced among the Varangian pagans. So the idea that they had to make a great quantity of mead was not surprising. Well, Olga, with a small group of attendants, arrived at Igor's tomb, and she did indeed weep, and she did indeed hold a funeral feast. And the Drevlians drank like pigs, and her guys kind of held back. And once the Drevlians were all absolutely knee-walking drunk, they killed them, all of them. And according to the Chronicle, she went about herself egging on her retinue to the massacre of the Drevlians. Anyhow, the Chronicle, and Olga returned to Kiev to prepare an army to finish off the business. This one was, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
She went around their territory and reduced various settlements. By reduced, I mean conquered. And then she led her army to a city, Korston it is now, which was the capital, their capital, and that's the city where her husband had been killed. And they had walls, and so she had to lay a siege, which lasted, according to the legend, for a year. And then Olga thought, I have a plan. So she sent them a message. Why do you persist in holding out? All your cities have surrendered to me and submitted to tribute, so that the inhabitants now cultivate their fields and their lands in peace. But you had rather die of hunger without submitting to tribute. And the Drevlians said, well, you know, we would submit to tribute, but we're afraid of you because we think you're still ready to avenge your husband by killing more people, particularly since this is a city where he's killed. And Olga said, no, the murder of all the messengers and the events of the feast night, that was enough. She was satisfied, but they had to give her tribute if they wanted peace. But she'd make it just a symbolic tribute. From each house, give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows. And the Drevlians thought, wow, that's cool. So, yeah, we'll do that. And they did. She was given 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from each of the houses in the city. She instructed her army to attach a piece of sulfur with small pieces of cloth to the feet of each bird. At nightfall, they lit the sulfur afire and released the birds, who flew home. They returned to their nest in the city, and, as the primary chronicle says, there was not a house that was not consumed, that it was impossible to extinguish the flames because all the houses caught fire at once. As the people fled the burning city, Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them, killing some and giving the others as slaves. All right, again, pretty much fairy tale, but it's fun to tell. I enjoyed that.
Wow.
That gives you a sense of what kind of society we're talking about. All right, not that actually happened, but that's the kind of thing they admired and wished had happened. All right. Olga remained the ruler of Kiev and Rus. The Varangians were not as averse, like the North. They were not as averse to women in positions of power as most of their contemporary peoples were. And she apparently was pretty good. They valued birth and position over gender. And she made a lot of changes with the support of the army. One of the main things was tribute had formerly been arbitrary at the whim of the rulers, but she set up a schedule of it and regularized it. It really became a sort of corporate taxation as opposed to just, I got to work them up, I need money, fork over, But she also was famous for establishing actual laws. Giving actual law. Now, where she dreamed them up, we don't know, and what they were, we don't know. But she did establish laws and tried to rule by those laws rather than just whatever occurred to her. And she also set up trading posts to collect like tolls along some of the rivers in her The rivers are the main way of traveling. Boundary posts, towns, trading posts. These trading centers were also administrative centers. They were both administrative and economic. And she really was trying to, pull the country together and make it into a country. She didn't really succeed, but she was trying. Now her son, whom we'll get to later, was not particularly interested in governance. He was a warrior. We'll read about him later, or hear about him later. He was a warrior, and he was often away. And she, continuing, by the way, to turn down multiple proposals of marriage, preferring to be the boss. And I'll talk later about the siege of Kiev in 968, and in which she really distinguished herself. Now, for whatever reason, and this gets interesting, sometime in the 950s, there's a question about the date, she took a trip to Constantinople to visit the Emperor Constantine VII. Why I say we have some questions about this is because in addition to the primary chronicle, we have two other sources about this visit. And they all disagree on why she went there, when she went there, what happened there, and how it happened. So, it's pretty vague. But according to the primary chronicle, which I'm going to stick with, once in Constantinople, Olga converted to Christianity with the approval of the emperor and under instruction from the patriarch Polyeuctus. Now, the patriarch of Constantinople was the head of the Orthodox churches, so he's sort of like the Pope. So Olga converting to Christianity and getting instruction, this is like having the Pope teach your confirmation class, but hey, she was, upper class. The primary chronicle does not explicitly state Olga's motivation for her conversion, but it tells a whole lot about the conversion process, about, the catechumenate and baptism instruction. So it's really useful to modern church historians. In any event, she was baptized. She chose the Christian name Helena after both the mother of Constantine the Great, Constantine I, and also the contemporary emperor's wife. Now, there is a photo of her. Is it up? No. No, that's the boat. That's the guys getting put in the boat. No. It's one I sent you. No.
Going wrong direction.
It's a picture of her. Yes, that's it. Okay. I want to show you this not because I think it's historically accurate at all in any way, but because this is 20th century. This was painted by a guy who's still alive and painted. I can't remember his name at the moment. I'm sorry. He's still alive. I mean, he's in his 60s now. So my point is, Olga's still very much alive in the memory of the Russians and the people of Ukraine. She's still a great, she's kind of a folk figure, I guess. Now, she was not the first person from the Rus to convert from paganism to Christianity. In fact, there had been some Christians in her husband Igor's court, and she had Christians in her court, and they were very influential. But she was the most powerful Rus individual and the first ruler to accept baptism. So, was this merely a political maneuver to getting good with the Byzantines, or was it a genuine conversion? Well, the primary chronicle reports that after receiving a final blessing from the patriarch, she returned home and began to attempt to convert her son to Christianity. This is what the chronicle says. Now, Olga dwelt with her son Sviatoslav, and she urged him to be baptized, but he would not listen to her suggestion. Though when any man wished to be baptized, he was not hindered, it was legal. but only mocked. For to the infidels, the Christian faith is foolishness. They do not comprehend it because they walk in darkness and do not see the glory of God. Their hearts are hardened, and they can neither hear with their ears nor see with their eyes. Thus the Chronicle. So she's failing with her son, Sviatoslav. This passage highlights the hostility towards Christianity in Kiev and Rus in the 10th century. Stanislav in the Chronicle says that his followers would laugh at him if he were to accept Christianity. Olga tried to convince her son that his followers would follow his example if he converted. He said no, he was not interested. He was totally not interested. Sviatoslav was happy being a pagan and was an enthusiastic one. But he did agree that there would be no persecution from the king, from him, of those who did convert. And that was important. It did help the growth of the church. But the people in general were resistant. The people in general were not interested. And Olga did build churches in Kyiv and a couple of other places, but without any terribly great success. Her clergy, of course, had been brought from Constantinople, but in 959, she did a very interesting thing. She sent an embassy to Otto I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, hence Catholic, Latin Christian, and requested the emperor to send her a bishop and some priests. And he agreed to introduce Latin Christianity. Now, when you look at what was happening in other places, like remember Wenceslas's area, where the Latin Christians and the Byzantine Christians were at each other's throats, you might wonder why, given all that trouble caused in other places by the hostility between the two types of Christians, why did Olga invite Roman, Latin-speaking clergy into her country? According to one school of thought, she did it because she wanted to motivate the Byzantine priests to missionize the Rus more energetically. By introducing some competition. She thought if they, it would make the one she had work harder. Emperor Otto said yes, but he waited 2 years to send them. And when they arrived 2 years later, they got chased out. What had changed? Olga had lost power to a large degree. She still retained influence, but her son, Sviatoslav, the pagan, had become the main guy. He's now in charge. And in that 2-year gap between asking for them and their arriving, Sviatoslav had gotten even more pagan and pagan and pagan. There had been a sort of bloodless coup against Olga, and her power and even her influence severely reduced. And in 962, 1 year later, Olga resigned as regent. She retired. She died 7 years later. And and just a couple of days after, or a short time after, what I mentioned earlier, the siege of Kyiv. What had happened here is that her son, Sviatoslav, was out campaigning in the Balkans, and a group close to them, a group of Turks, decided that this would be called the Pechenegs, and we'll hear more about them later, that this would be a great time to take Kyiv, and they laid siege to the city. Now, Olga at this time was not officially the ruler of the city, but she took charge. And just by her prestige, she was able to do that and successfully defended the city until Sviatoslav could get his big army back and chase the Pecheneg Turks away. 3 days later, she died. This is the story, again, from the Chronicle. I really enjoyed the Chronicle. Sviatoslav announced to his mother and his nobles, "I do not care to remain in Kiev, but would prefer to live in a place I cannot pronounce on the Danube, since that is the center of my realm, where all riches are concentrated, gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from Rus, furs, wax, honey, and slaves," a major export. But Olga said, "You behold me in my weakness." She was very ill. "Why do you desire to depart from me?" For she was already in precarious health. She thus remonstrated with him and begged him first to bury her and then go wherever he would. 3 days later, she died. Her son wept for her with great mourning, as did likewise her grandsons and all the people. Thus they carried her out and buried her in her tomb. Olga had given command not to hold a funeral feast, the pagan feast, for her, for she had a priest who performed the last rites over the princess. So although he was openly hostile to Christianity, Sviatoslav accepted Olga's request that her priest, Gregory, who had also been her son's tutor, conduct a Christian funeral without the ritual pagan burial feast. Her tomb remained undisturbed for 200 years, but the Mongolian Tartars took care of it in 1240. They utterly destroyed it. Now, as significant as what she did do in building churches, importing Byzantine clergy to Christianize the country, openly practicing Christianity, including participating in Christian worship and advocating for the interest of the church, what she did not do is almost as important. Given the background, given the sort of society this was, she did not attempt to convert people either by force or by placing any sort of restrictions on the pagans. There were no persecutions. There were also no aggressive wars after her conversion, not as long as she was in charge. She had been a capable, energetic, and previously ruthless pagan ruler. I mean, that was, the story, the mystery, I think, is an illustration of how her character was seen. And I think capable, energetic, and ruthless really fit. But after her conversion, she became a capable, energetic, and humane one. She focused her considerable abilities on improving the social and economic well-being of her subjects, as well as attempting to convert them. Hers was, I would say, a true conversion. Now, not merely a political ploy to improve her relations with Byzantium. And that is why she is considered the patron of adult converts as well as widows. She was hailed as a saint almost upon her death. And this was another one of those things where it was a sort of people's choice deal. This didn't go through Constantinople. It was just something that people believed, and she is considered a saint today. Well, she was succeeded by her son, Sviatoslav. Sviatoslav is a great hero in Ukraine and Russia. There are statues of him all over the place. And he's known variously as Sviatoslav the Brave and Sviatoslav the Conqueror, because he totally reversed his mother's foreign policy, as well as a lot of other policies. And immediately upon arising power, began to wage wars of conquest against any number of enemies. He was often allied with former enemies and just as often turning enemy against former allies. If he thought he could win it, he'd fight it. And he was highly successful as a fighting man. He greatly expanded the territory. At the height of his success, he laid claims on territory from the River Danube to the Black Sea. and well into southern Russia. Now, he couldn't really enforce all those claims all the time, but but he could claim. The primary chronicle tells us that his army was remarkably fast moving because he allowed it to use no wagons or cooking equipment on his campaigns. He said that the soldiers lived on small strips of horse flesh, game, or beef roasted over their campfires. I would add that this was undoubtedly supplemented by whatever they could steal from whoever territory they were passing through. And the chronicle further states that he did not use a tent, but slept in the open, spreading out his horse's saddle blanket under him over the ground and using his saddle as a pillow, and that all his troops were required to follow this example. This is nomad stuff. This is the sort of thing that, that the Mongols and others of their ilk were doing. And that's his style of warfare, and he was apparently very, very good at it. Maybe too good for his own good. The Emperor of Byzantium, Nicephorus II, convinced, bribed, Sviatoslav to attract the Bulgars and the Balkans because they were pushing into Byzantine territory. And he did, very successfully. So successfully that the Byzantine Empire then convinced, bribes, the Pecheneg Turks to attack Kyiv. That's why they were there when his mother took over the handling things. And after her death, he took his 3 sons and put them in charge of 3 separate areas of the realm, under his authority, of course. And then returned to war, only this time it's against the Byzantines. All right? He hadn't fought them in a while, then they'd turn their backs on him. They had a new emperor, John I. He gained the throne by assassinating Nicephorus, with whose wife he was having an affair. I mean, these are lovely people. But he, the new emperor, is putting down a serious insurrection in the eastern part of his empire. So that seemed to Sviatoslav to offer an absolutely golden opportunity for conquest and plunder, particularly because he forged alliances with the pagan Magyars and the pagan Pechenegs and some of the Bulgars as well, put together a real big army. And they pretty much drove the Byzantines out of all of the Balkans. And he was on a roll. And he decided that, let's go for the big prize. And he overplayed his hands when he decided to besiege Constantinople. And a new emperor, John I, was still in the east fighting that campaign. And the city was on the verge of complete panic, because here's Sviatoslav, who's beaten everybody he's come up against, who's coming for them. John couldn't leave. He had a fight on his hands in the east, but he appointed his brother-in-law, Vladimir, in charge of the defense of the imperial capital. Now, Michael Sellas is a Byzantine scholar of the next generation, described Bardas as a man who is not only a competent planner, but extremely clever in carrying out his schemes, possessed of vast wealth with the prestige of royal blood and of success in great wars, with all the military caste at his side to help on his enterprise. Well, he was all that and more. Bardas was first-class fighting man, first-class general, smart. He held his army in the city, continuing to train and equip them, all the while scouting out Sviatoslav's most likely route of advance. And he waited until they were very close to within 150 miles of Constantinople. And then, even though his army was much smaller, than Sviatoslav's. We don't know exact numbers. But we do know how the battle went. He marched out, and as I said, they'd been scouting out the most likely routes of advance. He took his army into a city called Archidiopolis, which is Archidiopolis is maybe 130 miles or so from the city. So pretty close, a 3-day march. And they sat down there for a few days and I guess rested up, and also gave Sviatoslav the idea that they were just going to hold that city and force him to besiege it. But that's not what they did. He took his army out, and in a move that's somewhat reminiscent of Lee at Chancellorsville, he split his army up, even though they were smaller, and sent only a relatively small portion of it to attack Sviatoslav's army. Well, they did attack. They attacked the Pecheneg's contingent, and they put up a pretty good fight. Not a whole lot of casualties on either side, and then they started retreating. It was a fighting retreat. They were drawing back in good order. The Pechenegs followed them. This is about a third of Sviatoslav's army, figuring, okay, we got them now. Well, didn't have them, because what he'd done with the rest of his army was set up an ambush, where at a spot where there was a relatively narrow passage between two large forests. And they waited until all the Pechenegs got in there, and then the ones who had feigned their retreat turned around, and the others came in from both sides, and it was a slaughter. Wow. It was an amazing loss of life. And as was the case most commonly in ancient warfare, once a battle was decided, that's when the real killing started. So the pursuit, when the other side is routed and you're following up, that's when most of the casualties would occur. And the rest of the army routed too upon seeing the Pechenegs running. So, and there was a huge slaughter. It was a total victory. It broke Sviatoslav so much that he took what remained of his army and went into a city in the north and went into what were essentially winter quarters. Well, Emperor John finished dealing with the insurrection and decided to finish his business with Sviatoslav. So he took his army to that city and laid siege to it. It only held out for 2 months. And then he surrendered on terms. The terms were he would abandon the Balkans, he would renounce his claims to Crimea, and in return all of his forces west of the Dnieper River. And that's right up to Kyiv. I mean, he lost it all. All of his western conquests were lost. What did he get in return? Food for the passage and an assurance of safe passage back to Kyiv. But the emperor, given Sviatoslav's history, was fairly confident that he was unlikely to abide by those terms any longer than it would take him to raise a new army. So he bribed the Pecheneg Khan, the ruler of the Pecheneg Turks, the ones who'd been beaten up so badly, to kill Sviatoslav before he reached Kiev. Sviatoslav's son Sven attempted to warn him to avoid the route through Pecheneg territory, but he ignored that advice, and they did kill him. He was ambushed and killed in 972. The primary chronicle reports that his skull was made into a drinking goblet by the Pecheneg Khan. So, in addition to being Sviatoslav the Brave and Sviatoslav the Conqueror, I suppose we can also refer to him as Sviatoslav the Cup. And that finally brings us to the saint that I want to focus on. Not that old, but isn't interesting. But this saint is in many ways much more influential. Remember that Sviatoslav had appointed his 3 sons to rule as subordinates, right? Over 3 different portions of the country. Well, they were typical of their time and place. They immediately went to war with each other. And Vladimir, the eldest son, Vladimir was not the eldest son. Yaropolk was the eldest son. Yaropolk murdered the third brother, the other brother, and Vladimir left. He just bailed out. He left the country and headed west. He knew he was going to be killed if he stayed. So that left Yaropolk as sole ruler. But he didn't stay that way long, because Vladimir wasn't just running away. And he apparently managed to take a lot of money with him, or at least he made good promises. Because what he did, he put together a Varangian Viking mercenary army and came back and deposed Yaropolk. Now, here's a story that will tell you what kind of guy Vladimir was. On the way to confront Yaropolk, he took his army on a little side trip to a town in Belarus called Petosk. He went there to visit Rogvolod, the prince of Belarus, and his family, especially his daughter Rogneda, who was engaged to be married to Yaropolk. Right? Okay. Vladimir had sent word to Rogvolod that he wished to marry Rogneda and enter into an alliance with Rogvolod to overthrow Yaropolk. Well, Rogvolod made the mistake of asking Rogneda what she thought about this. And her response was, "I will not draw off the boots of a slave son, but I want Yaropolk instead." This is a reference to Vladimir's mother, who is an interesting character who's believed to have lived to the age of 100, although who knows. The Norse sagas write about her. We know about his mother from them. And it is said that she was a prophetess who lived in a cave. Nothing is said about her parentage, so there's, she may have been very lower class, we don't know. And her name was Malusha. It's interesting that the fact of, Malusha had been brought by Yaroslav to Kiev to become, by Sviatoslav to Kiev to be sort of his house prophet, all right? And and apparently he found other occupation for her too, because when her first son was born, he was very happy to claim him as his son, and that's Vladimir. Now Vladimir was raised with the other 2 sons. Vladimir was not treated as second rate, and indeed he was one of the 3 who was appointed to rule over one of the areas of the city. Malusha had a brother named Dobrynya who was brought in to tutor Vladimir, and who for the rest of his life was Vladimir's most trusted advisor. It's interesting that, to me, that Rogneda, the princess, didn't seem to care that he was illegitimate. She was only offended by the fact that his mother hadn't been noble. But the pagans in general weren't too concerned about the niceties of marriage rules. They were polygamous, and lots of them had multiple wives. And concubinage was common. Lots of them had concubines. This note about taking off the boots of a slave, it appears that the taking off of the husband's boot was apparently some wedding custom, that the bride did that on the night of the wedding. Anyhow, Vladimir's messengers returned to him and told him everything that Rognita had said, and also that Rogvolod had refused his assistance. That's why Vladimir visited with his army to address the situation, which he did by smashing Rogvolod's forces, killing him and both his sons, and forcing Rognita to marry. That's Vladimir. Okay. He also was successful in defeating Yaroslav, who was captured and killed. And that did leave Vladimir the only surviving one of the three brothers, and now sole ruler of the Kievan Rus. By 980, he consolidated his realm. He all the way to the Baltic and solidified frontiers and established a very successful pagan dynasty. Well, he continued to successfully wage aggressive war and expanded the territories even greater than his father had, even going into Poland. Now, Christianity had spread to some degree in the region earlier on. But Vladimir remained a thoroughgoing pagan. He is said to have had 800 concubines. I consider that to be a stretch. Along with at least 5 and possibly as many as 7 wives. But what we do know for sure is that he did erect a number of pagan shrines to a number of different gods. And pagan shrines, pagan statues. Realize now, he's got his Varangian elite. He's got the Slavs, who are the most of the people, and he's got all these other people he's also brought under his authority. So, yeah, polytheism, I'm sure, made a lot of sense. And one of the pagan temples that he built was right there in Kyiv, in the capital, and it was dedicated to 6 different gods. Some of whom were Slavic, some of whom were Nordic. The primary dedication was to Perun, who was the god of thunder and war, and a favorite, obviously, a Viking favorite. Okay. Well, there were Christians in there, and there was a great deal of tension, particularly because the Christians clearly disrespected the deities that so many of the people revered, the pagan people. And finally, one particular incident brought things to the breaking point. Okay, I'm going to go back to the primary chronicle. After return from the city from a victorious military expedition, Vladimir, together with his people, made sacrifice to the idols. And the elders and nobles said, "Let us cast lots upon the boys and girls, upon whichever one it falls, that one we shall slaughter in sacrifice to the gods." This doesn't mean just slaves. It means everybody. Okay? I told you, he's a serious pagan. Now, there was a certain Varangian whose house was situated by the spot where now stands the Church of the Holy Virgin, which Vladimir built. Vladimir's not a Christian yet. He hadn't built that church yet. He's going to be. This Varangian had immigrated from Greece. When these people said Greece or Greeks, they're talking about Constantinople. Right? Even though they referred to themselves as Romans, they called them Greeks. He adhered to the Christian faith and had a son, fair in face and in heart, on whom, through the devil's hatred, the lot fell. Messengers thus came to the father and said, Since the lot has fallen upon your son, the gods have claimed him as their own. Let us therefore make sacrifice to the gods. But the Varangian Christian replied, these are not gods, but only idols of wood. Today it is, and tomorrow it will rot away. These gods do not eat or drink or speak. They are fashioned by hand out of wood. But the God whom the Greeks serve and worship is one. It is he who has made heaven and earth, the stars, the moon, the sun, and mankind, and has granted him life upon the earth. But what have these gods created? They are themselves manufactured. I will not give up my son to devils. So the messengers went back and reported to the people, and a mob gathered, armed, and went to the Varangian's house. And they broke down the stockade around his house and found him standing with his son upon his porch. They then called upon him to surrender his son that they might offer him to the gods. But he replied, if they be gods, they will send one of their number to take my son. What need have you of him? And they went for him. And they killed them, both of them. And the chronicle says, and no one knows where they were buried, for at this time the people were ignorant pagans. This started a wave of persecution. Now, they were not dictated from the top down. They were popular. Across many places in the realm, Christians suddenly found themselves under persecution by the pagans. Vladimir did not encourage that, but it was happening. Anyhow, these men, Theodore the father and John the son, had shown great courage in standing against the crowd of angry pagans. And the legend is that this courage so impressed Vladimir that it influenced his decision to become a Christian. Well, what's not legend, but fact, is that after their martyrdom, Vladimir did an interesting thing. He sent ambassadors out to report back to him of what they saw and what they favored of the four monotheistic religions of his day: Islam, Western Christianity, Eastern Christianity, and Judaism. When they came back, they reported that they were absolutely stunned by what they saw in Constantinople. And they said, then we went to Greece. I'm reading again from the Chronicle. Then we went to Greece, Constantinople, and the Greeks, including the emperor himself, led us to the edifices where they worshiped their God, and we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at loss how to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations, for we cannot forget that beauty. They must have been taken to Hagia Sophia. It must have been. At any event, the ambassadors returned very, very enthusiastic about Eastern Christianity. And Vladimir was impressed, and he saw to it that persecutions and aroused his discouraged. But he still remained pagan. He did not convert. There were more and more conversions, particularly after word of the ambassador's visit got around. He didn't convert until 988. Aha. Once again, politics. The then emperor had a problem. He had yet another revolt going on or in the east. And this was a real serious. This was the new emperor. And he had a serious fight going on in the eastern part, and he needed troops, and he needed good troops. Well, Vladimir's guys were Varangians. Incidentally, from the 10th through the 14th century, the personal guard, which was a large military force, not just, Secret Service type, but it was a military unit. The personal guard of the Byzantine emperors was known as the Varangian Guard, because that's where they recruited from. And so he went to Vladimir, or sent message to Vladimir, saying that he wanted to hire, essentially, 6,000 men to help him flesh out his army and save his throne. And Vladimir replied, yeah, we can work that out if I can marry your sister Anna. Woo! Now this showed considerable audacity in the entire history of, which was pushing well over 500 years at this point, in the entire history of the Byzantine Empire, no imperial princess had ever married a pagan. No imperial Christian had ever even married a Latin Christian, even though there had been proposals of marriage from French kings and Holy Roman emperors, and they'd all been turned down flat. But he needed those soldiers. Well, to marry the princess to a pagan Slav was impossible. But Vladimir was baptized, taking the Christian name of Basil, which happened to be the name of the emperor, as well as another saint. And the sacrament of baptism was swallowed almost immediately by his wedding to Anna, because Vladimir had accepted terms. And the terms were that he would be baptized, that he would become a Christian, and that he would Christianize his people. He did. It was for real. He got back to Kyiv and immediately started destroying pagan. Look, he's still Vladimir, right? Destroying pagan monuments, destroying pagan shrines, and establishing many churches, starting with a church in Kyiv dedicated to St. Basil. Yeah, it's all politics. Anyhow. But he turned his very considerable talents away from aggressive warfare to improving the lives of his people. He was so successful that his reign is considered the end of the Varangian period of Eastern Slavic history and the beginning of the Christian period. That's how successful he was. The country prospered. He was the first Kiev and Rus ruler to mint his own coinage. Primarily, previously they'd been circulating various types of foreign coins. He invented and regularized the currency. He negotiated treaties rather than going to war, and these are mostly trade treaties. Both the imports and the exports of the country surged. He established schools, and he strongly urged, didn't require, don't think he had the authority, but he strongly urged the nobility to see their sons educated in more than warfare. And they imported scholars from Byzantium to teach. He protected the poor to a large degree. And he lived mostly at peace. It was mostly peaceful, yes, I know. He mostly at peace with his neighbors. He very rarely went to war, except to defend against various raids and incursions, particularly by the Pechenev Turks, who were just a thorn in his side. All branches of the economy prospered under Vladimir, largely because he stayed at peace and didn't waste the country's money in war. Look, make no mistake, this guy was an autocrat. He was the governor, period. There were no governmental reforms of that nature. But there were legal reforms. He introduced the Byzantine law code. So it's not just whatever I think of, I want to be law. He brought in Byzantine law, which was established law and very well developed. But not entire. He reformed it to some degree. He abolished capital punishment. He abolished judicial torture. And he abolished mutilations as punishments. Literacy became reasonably widespread. And it's during his rule that the first native works of literature appear. He did practice, probably as sign of humility, personal acts of charity, handing out food and drink to those who needed it, and even going out to the poor to do so. Interestingly, I think to me, it is said that he did this not in response to Christ's command, feed the hungry, but rather in imitation of Simon of Cyrene. Lent's coming up. Everybody should know who Simon of Cyrene is because he's one of the Stations of the Cross. He's the one who is recorded in 3 different Gospels as having helped Jesus to carry his cross. And it is said, it is written of Vladimir that he saw that he should imitate Simon, and that his alleviation of the burdens of poverty is a way to help people laboring under their cross, which is poverty, rather than seeing it primarily as simply an act of obedience. In 1014, his son, one of his sons, later to be known as Yaroslav the Wise, but he really ought to be called Yaroslav the Lucky, because Yaroslav stopped paying tribute to his father, which is the first step on trying to secede. And Vladimir decided, sadly, he had to go beat him up. So he began assembling troops to move against him, but he fell ill, and he died in 1015, and was immediately hailed as a saint. Various parts of his body were chopped off and sent around to various places to be used as relics. In his reign, he had transformed what had essentially been a tribal people into a Christian nation. And both Russia and Ukraine see him as a founding father.
Sorry, see him as a what?
A founding father. Now, compare and contrast. Wenceslaus was raised to be a Christian and was exceedingly pious from his youth. Vladimir was a flat-out pagan and enthusiastic about it because they didn't have concubines or anyhow. Wenceslaus was of almost universally saintly character throughout his life. Vladimir had been a real stinker. But who really did the most for the spread of the kingdom of God?
Vladimir.
I think it's arguable. It's arguable. I want to get you arguing. It's arguable. And that's one thing I'd like you to consider and talk about. And here's the other thing. Conversion. Possibly with Olga, certainly with Vladimir. They had mixed motives for their conversions. There were clearly political benefits. There were clearly political benefits to becoming converted. It's sort of like, oh shoot, somebody who knows more French history than me. The Protestant French Henry, who became
Henry
IV, yeah. He was offered the crown of France on condition that he become a Catholic. To which he replied, "Parish is worth a mass," and took it.
It was well worth it.
It worked out well for him. But you know, you could, if you want to be cynical about it, you can argue that these were political conversions. But it seems to me that they both were enthusiastic about what they did once they did it. And quite honestly, I'm not sure that any human motives are completely pure. I think they're generally mixed. And I want to offer you this example as a bit of pastoralia. If you're convinced to distrust yourself because you say that you had mixed motives in doing some good thing, think about this. Think about this. They had mixed motives too. And they achieved great things, particularly Vladimir, and for the church, for God. And at their death, people hailed them as saints. Saints aren't perfect. Saints are people. And the fact that you're not perfect doesn't mean you might not be a saint, recognized or unrecognized. Throughout this period, for long afterwards, the influence of rulers was very, very heavy. In fact, they generally had more influence than anybody else over the political affairs, the economic affairs, and the religious affairs of their subjects. That's going to change. That's going to change. And it's going to change soon in the medieval period, when we'll begin seeing saints rise up who are not rulers, who sometimes come from shockingly humble backgrounds, and who wind up being more influential in the development of the Christian faith, more influential sometimes even in the events of their times than the crowned heroes. But that's for next time. And since, I'm terrible on dates, I have to always remember. Since Vladimir died in 1015, that makes him an 11th century saint. And I think that's enough 11th century facts. I want to get into the medieval period. So I've already picked the saints for the next session. I think you're going to find it very interesting. They're both two you've probably heard of, and they're totally different. One is Hildegard of Bingen, and the other is Thomas of Becket. Totally different, all right? And it'll be a different era. It'll be a different sort of society for sure. And I hope I have as much fun researching it this week as I expect to have, because I am certainly not an expert on Hildegard of Bingen, and I have some mixed feelings about Thomas of Canterbury. So, what do y'all think?
Well, look at King David. I mean,
Perfect example.
yeah. Look at King David. When you actually read the passages in the scripture about David, he was a wretched sinner. I mean,
Oh, he was.
and yet, I can't forgive him for the Uriah the Hittite. I mean, it's just outrageous to do that what he did.
I don't like what he did to Joab.
And I agree with that as well as and yet he certainly was used as a vehicle.
Old evangelical saying, God can strike a mighty blow with a crooked stick. I like that a lot. Ma'am.
Just because you get into something with mixed motive doesn't mean you don't get convinced later to become enthusiastic.
Yeah. But I don't think, I'm not certain that anybody's motives are pure, completely unmixed. We're not that simple. And, you know, if your good motives are stronger than your bad motives, you're probably a little better. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have them, doesn't mean it's kind of shameful, but still, that's it. And, you know, one question that I have been asked numerous times is how I, at a time that was, when it was not at all fashionable, believe it, to do it, how I wound up going abroad, going into the mission field. And the thing about it, I realized that my motives are mixed. I went into chapel every day and saw, or almost every day, and saw the words, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel." And I was surrounded by people who weren't going to do that. Most of the other seminarians I knew had no interest whatsoever in foreign missions. There were very few. And somehow that compelled me. And then I met Bishop Zulu, and that worked too. But I also know that part of the motivation was it seemed exciting to do something that would be maybe a little dangerous. Didn't turn out to be as dangerous as it could have been. Thank God we didn't go to Liberia, which we almost did. But something that would be difficult and challenging and almost a little romantic. That there were, I did not see it as a great sacrifice, which it didn't turn out to be. It turned out to be one of the most productive and, I think, developmentally important periods in our lives. That was a mixed motive. But I'm not ashamed of it, because it wasn't all of that. This is a real problem in historiography. You know, this ridiculous theory that the American Revolution came about because the big Southern planters owed money that they couldn't pay to British merchants. It's ridiculous. There's a huge philosophical basis for it, and it was a popular movement across, a movement among people across all the colonies. And you still see that. I put it down to the baleful influence of Marxism, which sees everything as economic in nature. It's not. And we are complicated creatures, we human beings. And I would ask you, if you're facing any kind of crisis of conscience about this, in terms of mixed motives or whatever, how can I put this? Even if your heart condemns you, God does not condemn you. And God is greater than your heart. So, when you see these things, be willing to recognize that God has forgiven you, and you're not required to have higher standards than He does.
Father, can I make a little confession too that fits exactly with what you're saying? When I was a young woman, I wanted to be an opera singer, and I sang very well. And I'm telling you that I don't care what anybody says, when you sing in church, and it's for the glory of God, you love it when people tell you that you have done well. You just love it. And any singer who professes it's all for the Lord, that's nonsense. You love that praise. It's just there. Exactly.
Well, God uses what He's got. And unfortunately, all He's got is us. So. Yes, so far I think He's done a pretty good job. Any other things? No? Ma'am.
I have two questions. The first one is the map on the screen. Maybe we missed it. We were 3 minutes late. One path is blue, the other's red, and then there's a bunch of orange. Is there like a significance, or is that just to show the map?
This map shows the area around Kyiv and Rus in this period. This is the river Dnieper. Ooh, look at that. I made it big. This is the river Dnieper, and this is the river Don, which goes down the Caspian Sea. And the reason for outlining those is this map is showing that the Varangians were Vikings. That's what they were. They had come down these rivers to settle in these areas.
Thanks.
And this is really interesting because you notice here's the Khazar Khaganate. These guys, these guys are Muslims. These guys were pagans at this point. They'll later become Muslims. Notice this is Volga, Bulgaria. We tend to think of Bulgaria over here in the Balkans. Well, yeah, but the Bulgaria takes its name from the people. The people don't take their name from the place. And one of the remarkable things about ancient history, as well as up to this period, is how whole peoples would migrate. And one example of that later. And Bulgaria takes its name from the Bulgars. The Bulgars don't take their name from Bulgaria. Am I making sense? Same with Turkey. Nobody talked about this as Turkey until the Turks took it over. That's when it became Turkey. And by the way, the greatest example of this, at one point in about, I think, the 3rd or maybe 2nd century BC, the Gauls, the Celts, whom the Romans called Gauls, moved south, big time. Apparently there was a huge natural disaster, and a whole bunch of them from the seacoast just picked up and started looking for warmer lands. And they got down into Greece, and they got down into what is now Turkey. They didn't take it all over. But they did settle a large portion of Anatolia. They were Gauls. Wow. That's the Galatians from the Bible. That's what Galatia means, land of the Gauls. So,
where were the Gauls from on this map?
The Gauls
before they started migrating.
They wouldn't be on this map.
Oh,
much farther to the east. To the west.
To the west. Okay, so they came down not from Britain, from northern France or something. Today's modern.
At that point, yeah, they were in Britain at that point. The Celts were there.
Okay, Britain. Okay.
I mean,
The early Britons weren't.
Okay.
And then the Anglo-Saxons came in, and and then the Danes. I get remarkably. What is it? Oh gosh, the singer. Can't think of his name. Anyhow, it's the line from Pop Song. I used to get disgusted. Now I try to be amused whenever I hear people talk about stolen land. Every piece of land that anybody settled on previously belonged to someone else. Is it? Pardon me?
I think you're thinking of Billy English.
No, his first name's Elvis Costello.
Oh, okay.
Isn't the word conquer not stolen?
Yes. I like that. I'll steal that.
Speaking of stealing.
Okay, well, it's 9 o'clock. I have too much to do. And I try not to keep y'all after 9 unless you volunteer. So I guess we're at it. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Come back next week. I'm looking forward to really shocking you about Thomas. Is it vestry?
So you have choice.
Trying to stop that. Vestry is next week, so we won't be able to meet for 2 weeks. I'm sorry. I'm going to need it because physical is coming. I'm going to have to work hard.
No idea.
To convince y'all that some of the things you think about Thomas might not be true.
I think it's formulated based on the film that we all saw.
Which was a wonderful film.